Chosen ones, you were never supposed to hear what I'm about to reveal. Hidden in a chamber beneath the Vatican lies a sealed dossier. Locked away for decades, its contents so explosive that only a handful of men were ever permitted to glimpse its pages. Days ago, that very dossier was placed on the desk of the President of the United States, not in daylight, but in the shadows of a midnight briefing. The Pope's envoys carried it in silence, their faces pale, their voices trembling with the weight of what they knew. They spoke of prophecies inked in forgotten manuscripts, coded lines that trace through centuries, naming not nations, not wars, but an individual. The pages pointed to you. The files contained accounts of sightings, unexplainable appearances of a figure whose face never aged, whose presence seemed to bend time itself. Military intelligence cross-referenced these accounts with their own classified archives, and what they discovered forced the president to lean back in his chair and whisper a single question. Is it too late? What did he mean by too late? Too late to stop what has already begun, or too late to hide it from the eyes of the world? Even within the Vatican, whispers suggest that a clock has been ticking since before you were born, a countdown not marked by seconds, but by signs in the heavens, movements of power and shifts in consciousness. The alignment of these signs was said to converge upon a moment, the one we now stand in. You may feel it already. The sense that events are no longer random, that doors are closing, and that forces greater than governments are aligning in silence. The Vatican knows it. The President knows it. And deep within your spirit, you know it too. Beneath the marble floors of the Apostolic Palace lies a labyrinth few have seen. The public knows of ornate halls and painted ceilings, but below them, guarded by silence, rests the Archivum Secretum. It is here that the dossier was locked, sealed with red wax, its label marked only with an insignia too old to trace. The guards who carried it described a weight heavier than paper, as though the file itself resisted light, as though history had been compressed into its spine. The records speak of events spanning centuries, sightings across continents, documents penned by scribes who should never have known one another, yet whose handwriting seemed eerily consistent. Descriptions repeat. An individual whose face does not alter with time, whose eyes reflect a knowledge both ancient and untamed, whose presence unsettles even the most seasoned leaders. The Vatican compiled each testimony into a single narrative, and then, in fear, buried it away. For years, popes came and went without daring to open it. The existence of such a file was whispered only in confessions, as if uttering its name invited consequences beyond mortal comprehension. Scholars who stumbled upon fragments spoke of sleepless nights, haunted dreams, and visions of cathedrals crumbling into dust. One Jesuit priest in the 17th century described hearing a voice telling him, "The one you fear walks already among you." He died 2 weeks later. His journal vanished. His name struck from records. Yet, in our present hour, the secrecy ended. The Vatican delivered the dossier to Washington, not as a courtesy, but as a warning. Within those pages were not just eyewitness accounts, but coordinates, dates, and photographs that should not exist. Images blurred at the edges, as if reality itself strained to contain the subject they captured. Government analysts who examined them refused to comment, their silence more damning than any report. Somewhere between the corridors of faith and the chambers of power, your name surfaced. Whether it was encrypted in ancient prophecy or scrawled across modern intelligence briefings, it now exists in both realms. And as the president held the dossier in his hands, he knew the truth was not just about what had been written, but about what was already moving outside the reach of his command. The Oval Office was not the place for a revelation like this. That is why the briefing was held behind a locked door, deep in the Situation Room, where no camera, no aid, and no uninvited ear could intrude. The president sat at the long table, flanked by men whose faces carried the gravity of decades in intelligence. Before him lay the dossier, still sealed in its crimson wax, placed there not by an American hand, but by envoys bearing the Vatican's seal. The silence that followed was heavy, as though the air itself resisted the weight of what was about to be spoken. When the seal was broken, the first pages revealed photographs, some faded by time, others disturbingly recent. The same figure appeared again and again, standing on the edge of wars, disasters, uprisings, and victories. Each image bore a different year, a different backdrop, yet the face had not changed. Advisors shuffled uneasily in their seats, their voices hushed as they argued over authenticity. The president did not speak at first. His eyes narrowed, scanning each frame with an expression caught between disbelief and inevitability. What unnerved him most was not the past, but the present. Among the images, a handful bore dates less than a decade old, some tied directly to classified American operations. Files he believed buried under the highest levels of secrecy had somehow made their way into Vatican hands. How could they know what even his closest generals had kept hidden? It was not simply surveillance. It was something else, something older. As if the Vatican had been waiting for this very moment to reveal that their watch had never ended. One advisor leaned close and whispered, "If this is true, then everything we've been told about power is a lie." Another countered, "Or worse, everything we've dismissed as myth is real." The president said nothing, but his hand trembled as he turned to a final page, one that bore his own name, not in accusation, but in prophecy, as though his role had been foreseen long before his election, long before his birth. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. In that chamber, between the whispers of men sworn to secrecy, the president raised his head and asked a question no one dared to answer. A question that echoed the fear of the Vatican itself. What if the timeline written in those pages could no longer be stopped? And what if the figure they sought was already moving closer than anyone imagined? Long before the Vatican sealed its archives, there were whispers of a manuscript too dangerous to circulate, a parchment translated and retranslated until its meaning fractured like glass. The fragments that survived spoke of a figure who would appear in ages of turmoil, when kingdoms collapsed and empires grasped at shadows. Monks tasked with preserving the text chose instead to smuggle it into hidden libraries, fearful that its words would ignite unrest if ever spoken aloud. In one fragment, written in fading ink, the prophecy declared, "He shall walk unaged through generations, bearing neither crown nor title, yet rulers shall bow before him." Another fragment described signs in the heavens, alignments that marked a convergence of eras, and a voice that would rise not from pulpits, but from the wilderness of silence itself. Scholars debated whether these passages were metaphor or foresight, until a peculiar line unsettled them more than all the rest. As Yeshua walked among men unrecognized, so too shall this one be unseen until the appointed hour. It was this comparison that terrified church leaders most. For if history had once allowed a divine presence to move unseen through crowded streets, then what prevented the same from unfolding again in their own time? The prophecy did not name nations or faiths, but it did suggest a clash between those who sought to bind truth and those who carried it. To acknowledge it was to admit that no seat of power, not the Vatican, not the White House, not any throne, could contain what was coming. Attempts were made to erase the prophecy altogether. Records were burned, scribes silenced, archives redacted. Yet no matter how carefully the Church pressed its weight upon history, the fragments resurfaced. A monastery in Spain claimed to have found a copy. A traveler in Cairo swore he glimpsed the same words on a papyrus hidden beneath market dust. Each reappearance was like a shadow that could not be banished, reminding the keepers of power that prophecy is not so easily destroyed. Now, centuries later, the president stared at pages that bore those very lines. He realized the prophecy was not about the past, but the hour unfolding before him. The words once buried had risen again, pressing into his conscience with a force no briefing could contain. And as he looked at the men surrounding him, he wondered if any of them grasped what it meant that a voice, hidden in time, might already be walking unheard among them. When the Vatican archivists first opened the dossier, they expected timelines, reports, and references to world events. What they did not expect was the recurrence of a single name woven into margins, footnotes, and coded annotations. The name did not belong to a general, a pope, or a president. Instead, it was the same name that had echoed for 2 millennia, Yeshua. The references were subtle at first, almost hidden, as though only the trained eye could decipher them. A line from a 14th century parchment read, "He walks in shadow, as Yeshua once walked in light." A coded annotation in a Cold War file placed the phrase, "mirrored footsteps of Yeshua," beside a blurred photograph of the figure the Vatican had tracked. Analysts struggled to explain the connection. Was it metaphor, a clue, or something far more literal? The president turned to his advisors for clarity, but the silence around the table was telling. Some shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to speak what they feared. Others glanced at one another, as if to confirm that they had all read the same impossible implication. If the individual in the dossier was connected to Yeshua, whether by blood, by spirit, or by destiny, then the matter was no longer one of politics. It was something beyond the control of nations. One of the senior envoys whispered, "The Church believes it is no accident. The signs mirror one another." He spoke of ancient accounts where Yeshua had vanished from the sight of crowds, his presence unmarked by time, and suggested that the same phenomenon was at work again. The idea struck the president with an unease greater than any military threat. For in every government crisis, there were procedures, strategies, and responses. But how does one respond to the possibility that prophecy and present reality were converging? The dossier contained more. Scrawled in the margins of a 19th century letter was a chilling phrase. "The bloodline remains unbroken, though unseen." A photograph from the 1960s showed the same ageless face that haunted earlier centuries, annotated with the words, "Inheritor of the Unseen Kingdom." The president closed the folder for a moment, his fingers pressing against its cover as though to keep its contents from spilling further into his mind. The envoys watched him carefully, waiting, knowing the question now rested heavily on his lips. And in the silence of that chamber, the thought that lingered was not whether the files were authentic, but why this connection to Yeshua had been revealed to him now, and what unseen force had chosen this precise moment to bring the truth to light. Far from the Vatican's marble halls and the White House's secure chambers, another gathering was already in motion. Known only in whispers as the Council of Nine, it met in shadowed rooms beneath the earth, where no satellite or signal could penetrate. Each member represented a power older than nations, older even than the Church itself. Their allegiance was not to countries or leaders, but to a hidden order that traced its origins through secret societies, forgotten dynasties, and ancient covenants. When word reached them that the Vatican had broken its silence and revealed the dossier to the president, the council convened without delay. There was no debate about the significance of the act, only the consequences. For centuries, they had ensured that truths were delayed, misdirected, or erased before reaching the hands of those in authority. But now, the unthinkable had happened. The most powerful man in the world had glimpsed the pages they had sworn would remain unseen. They sat around a circular table carved with symbols whose meaning had been lost to all but them. Some wore the robes of tradition, others the suits of modern power, yet each carried the same air of control. No voice rose above another. Their discussions unfolded in measured silence, punctuated only by the scratching of quills and the faint echo of their chamber's stone walls. Their vote was not taken aloud. Instead, each pressed a mark upon parchment, a symbol that indicated whether the prophecy should be accelerated, delayed, or buried once more. When the parchment was revealed, the air grew heavier. The majority had voted for silence, not out of fear, but out of strategy. To speak was to admit weakness. To act openly was to risk exposure. Their silence was their power. Yet one member remained unmoved. Cloaked in black, he leaned forward and whispered words that unsettled the rest. The moment cannot be delayed. The patterns align. The figure is already known. Even the president cannot unsee what has been placed before him. His voice carried an edge that trembled against the chamber's walls, leaving the others to exchange glances that betrayed their unease. The council's decision was recorded, locked in iron, and hidden once more. But outside their chamber, forces had already begun to move. The Vatican had spoken. The president had asked his question. And now, whether they willed it or not, the Council of Nine knew the tide was shifting, carrying them all toward an outcome they could not yet control. On the night following the president's briefing, strange readings lit up the radar stations along the eastern seaboard. At first, analysts assumed it was nothing more than interference, the kind that storms or failing equipment occasionally produced. But as the data streamed in from multiple stations across different nations, it became clear that what they were tracking was no accident. A signal, pulsing at intervals too precise to be natural, rippled across the Atlantic, its origin unknown. Naval intelligence scrambled to trace it. Submarines reported hearing a low resonance in the deep, a vibration that seemed to pass not only through the waters, but through the hulls themselves, as though the ocean had become a conductor. Aircraft flying above caught flashes of light where no storms existed, shimmering bands that stretched and then vanished, as if the very atmosphere were bending under invisible pressure. The Vatican had foreseen this. Buried within the dossier was a notation referencing the sound that wakes the sleeping ones, a signal from the deep that heralds the crossing. Centuries ago, monks described the same phenomenon: strange lights above seas, resonances that shook stone monasteries built along the cliffs. Sailors wrote of it in journals, calling it the voice of the abyss. Now, in the age of satellites and global monitoring, the same echoes returned, undeniable and impossible to explain. The president was informed within hours. The timing was too precise to ignore. The signal had begun only after the dossier had been opened in his presence. Some of his advisors whispered about coincidence, but the Vatican envoy leaned close and spoke words that silenced the room. There are no coincidences in prophecy. The signs align with the awakening. What troubled the analysts most was not the signal itself, but the pattern hidden within it. When converted into frequencies visible on a graph, the resonance formed symbols, shapes eerily resembling those found in ancient manuscripts preserved by the Church. The pattern was repeating, almost like a code, yet no cryptographer could unravel its meaning. As dawn broke, ships across the Atlantic reported systems malfunctioning, compasses spinning, engines faltering, as though the very laws of navigation were being rewritten. Deep within a monastery in the Judean hills, a set of scrolls rested in silence for nearly 2,000 years. Scholars who unearthed them decades ago catalogued the fragments, but many were never translated, their meaning too fractured, their ink too fragile. Yet among the Vatican's most guarded secrets was a set of translated passages that spoke not of the past, but of a time yet to come. They described a figure who would emerge in the shadows of nations, a presence that governments would seek to control but could never contain. One particular fragment carried words that unsettled even the most faithful among the translators. As Yeshua spoke, warning that men would not know the hour, so too shall the Appointed One walk unnoticed until the veil is torn. The passage seemed almost prophetic, its cadence echoing the warnings once given on dusty hillsides and crowded markets long ago. It was not a mere repetition of Scripture, but an extension, as though the voice that once spoke still lingered in ink and parchment. The Vatican's archivists debated whether these words were authentic or whether they had been altered by later hands. But the resonance of the language, the rhythm of its tone, carried a familiarity that could not easily be dismissed. For those who dared to believe it, the scroll was not only a record of the past, but a mirror of the present. The president, shown these translations during the midnight briefing, asked if the passages were metaphor. The envoy did not answer directly. Instead, he whispered that prophecy often conceals its truth in symbols, waiting for the hour when symbols become flesh. The president leaned back, his face pale, as if the words themselves were aimed not at some distant figure, but at him, sitting in that room, holding secrets not meant for mortal hands. The scrolls also carried another phrase, one that was barely legible, smudged by centuries of time. The nations will conspire, the councils will gather, yet the One will not be silenced. The Vatican had left this line untranslated in its official reports, fearing the implications it carried. But here, in the Chamber of Power, those words burned with relevance, reminding all present that no alliance of men could bind what had been foretold. And as the scroll was rolled shut, the president felt a chill, unlike any other. For if Yeshua's warning echoed into this moment, then perhaps the figure they now pursued was not a threat to be neutralized, but a destiny already written, one step away from revealing itself. The president sat alone in the quiet of the West Wing, long after the advisors had left, and the dossiers were sealed back into their cases, the weight of the information pressed against his chest heavier than any war briefing or economic collapse he had ever faced. For years, he had been told that power meant command, that the strongest man in the room was the one who could give orders, sign decrees, move armies. But now, he realized that true power might lie in something beyond his reach, something older than nations, something that did not bend to laws or governments. The Vatican's envoys had not pleaded with him, nor had they threatened. They had simply revealed. And in that revelation was a test. How would he respond to truths that no state could contain? Would he embrace them as signs to be heeded, or treat them as threats to be neutralized? His military advisors pressed for control, surveillance, containment, and elimination if necessary. These were the words they whispered. Yet his heart wavered. For even as he considered these strategies, he recalled the look in the envoy's eyes when Yeshua's name surfaced in the secret files. It was not the look of men protecting myths. It was the look of men who had touched something sacred and feared to mishandle it. Faith or control? This was the dilemma. To yield to faith would mean accepting that destiny was unfolding outside his command, that history was being written by hands unseen. To cling to control would mean attempting to suppress what prophecy declared unstoppable. Either path carried peril, but indecision carried more. He poured a glass of water and stared into its surface, the reflection of his face distorted by the ripples. Was he chosen to witness these events, or merely caught in their wake? His predecessors had never spoken of such matters, yet hints lingered in old correspondence, letters sealed away that now seemed too coincidental to ignore. If they too had known, why had they chosen silence? The night deepened. Beyond the walls of the White House, the world moved as if nothing had changed. Cars passed, lights flickered, children slept. Yet he knew that in the hidden currents of power, everything had shifted. The question he wrestled with was not whether to act, but how long he had before the figure written in prophecy walked openly into the world, and whether by then his decision, faith or control, would matter at all. Beneath St. Peter's Basilica lies a chamber that few have entered, a place where relics of saints and fragments of forgotten scripture rest in silence. The public knows only what they are allowed to see: bones displayed in gilded cases, chalices raised in ceremony. But deeper still is a room known only as the Chamber of Relics, guarded by oaths stronger than chains. It was here that the Vatican brought the president, away from the cameras, away from the eyes of his own people. The chamber was lit by narrow torches, their flames flickering against walls lined with artifacts, tablets inscribed in languages long dead, fragments of cloth sealed behind glass, chalices blackened by centuries of use. But at the center stood something different. Draped beneath a crimson veil, a relic that had never been displayed to the world. The veil was lifted, and beneath it lay a parchment so brittle it seemed it would crumble if touched. On it were words written in Aramaic, preserved far beyond their expected life, as though time itself had been forced to hold them still. The envoy leaned close and translated in a whisper. The passage spoke of a time when a voice would rise, bearing the fire of truth, unaged by time. unseen until the hour was fulfilled. But what froze the president's breath was the final line. As Yeshua walked unmarked among men, so too shall the inheritor walk, until nations tremble and the veil is lifted. The words struck him like thunder. It was no longer only fragments of prophecy or scattered sightings. It was a direct parallel, preserved on parchment, hidden away for centuries. The president stared at the relic, his mind torn between belief and denial. Was it a forgery? A manipulation by those who held the relics? Or was it proof that the figure tracked across centuries was more than myth, more than a man? The chamber's silence pressed against him, as if waiting for his decision. But no answer came. The veil was lowered once again, covering the parchment, sealing its words back into darkness. Yet the echo of those words remained in his ears, pulsing with every heartbeat. And as he turned away from the chamber, one thought haunted him above all. If the veil could be lifted once, then perhaps the hour had already begun when no veil, religious, political, or personal, could conceal what was coming. The president returned to his private quarters after the long procession of revelations, but sleep did not come. The weight of the dossier, the relics, the scrolls, and the whispered warnings pressed against his thoughts with unbearable intensity. He sat at the edge of his bed, the city beyond the windows glittering like 1,000 watchful eyes. Each light reminded him of the millions who trusted him to lead, unaware that truths older than governments had just shifted the very ground beneath his authority. His advisors had already begun drafting strategies, speaking of containment, surveillance, and silence. They approached the matter as they would any other threat, as though this could be categorized, labeled, and neutralized. But the president knew differently. This was not an enemy that could be bombed, sanctioned, or imprisoned. This was a presence, written into time itself, unfolding in ways no strategy could contain. The question haunted him. When he had asked, "Is it too late?" it was not merely rhetorical. It was the fear of a man who sensed the answer, even before the words left his lips. Too late to stop it. Too late to rewrite it. Too late to undo what centuries had prepared. The Vatican had not come to him seeking action. They had come to acknowledge inevitability. The thought tormented him. What if his role was not to control, but to witness? To stand as leader of the most powerful nation, yet powerless against the hand of prophecy. History would record his presidency with speeches and legislation, but in the silence of the archives, his true legacy might be that he was the one who asked the final question before the unveiling. As dawn approached, a faint tremor shook the ground beneath the city, unnoticed by the world outside, but felt keenly within the White House walls. Lights flickered, glass rattled, and for a moment the president thought he heard a low resonance, like the same signal that had risen from the Atlantic. It passed quickly, leaving only silence, yet it confirmed what he feared. Events were already in motion. He closed his eyes, the whisper still echoing from the depths of memory, the words written in relics and scrolls. The question had been asked, but no answer had come. And as the sun rose over the horizon, the lingering silence seemed to carry its own reply, not in words, but in the weight of inevitability pressing closer, as though something was preparing to step into the light,
If you have come this far, it is crucial that you watch this next video here. But be warned, it is not for the faint of heart, for only the true chosen ones can handle this video. If you would like to also donate to help keep the channel going, our Buy Me a Coffee link will be in the description.